The neighborhood had always prided itself on its uniformity, every house lined neatly along the quiet suburban street, each lawn manicured to perfection, each mailbox painted to match the others, every shrub trimmed to geometric precision. Residents moved through their days in a rhythm dictated by the unspoken expectations of the HOA. A quiet but ever-present force that ensured the order of the cul-de-sac remained unbroken. Most people complied out of habit, a sense of civic duty, or the simple desire to avoid confrontation. But some, even in this idyllic environment, felt the pressure of scrutiny in ways that were relentless and suffocating. It began on a seemingly ordinary Monday morning. The sun rose over the row of identical rooftops, glinting off freshly mowed lawns and neatly parked cars. Yet, amid this picture-perfect street, one lawn stood out not for being overgrown, but for a subtle imperfection, a small patch of grass slightly taller than the HOA regulations allowed. The homeowner, a mid-30s professional who had moved into the neighborhood only a year earlier, had been away over the weekend. Their intentions had been innocent. A minor delay in mowing, nothing more. But the HOA had its eyes everywhere, and no small deviation went unnoticed. A crisp white envelope appeared under the doormat later that morning. The homeowner found it as they returned from work, the weight of authority pressing down through the simple act of holding the paper. Inside was a notice, formal in tone, outlining the violation. The grass had exceeded the HOA's maximum allowed height by half an inch. The language was strict, impersonal, almost mechanical. The deadline to correct the violation was stated clearly, along with the promise of escalating fines if ignored. It was a warning, precise and chilling in its clarity. The homeowner felt a mixture of disbelief and irritation. Half an inch of grass. Surely, there had to be some flexibility, some common sense, but the HOA had no tolerance for leniency, and everyone on the street knew it. Stories circulated quietly among neighbors' dailies, of residents fined for slightly crooked mailboxes, fences painted a shade too dark, and bushes that leaned just a fraction beyond the invisible line of The system was rigid, unforgiving, and merciless in its enforcement. As the homeowner measured the offending patch of grass, the anxiety began to creep in. The once friendly street had a way of feeling oppressive when authority loomed. Every glance from a passing neighbor now felt loaded with judgment. Every hum of a lawnmower in the distance seemed like a reminder of the standard that must be met. In a neighborhood designed to convey perfection, imperfection was a public offense, and the homeowner knew the consequences of ignoring it. The next morning, armed with a rented push mower, the homeowner approached the task with a mix of resignation and determination. The mechanical hum filled the quiet morning as blades cut precisely to regulation height. Yet, the act felt strangely punitive, almost ritualistic. The neighborhood watched, silently. It was difficult to tell if anyone truly cared, but the invisible gaze of the HOA was enough to create the tension. By the time the grass was trimmed to perfection, the homeowner's hands ached, and their mind was heavy with the understanding that compliance was no longer optional but a requirement enforced with unyielding authority. Even with the lawn now conforming perfectly, unease lingered. There were other residents, of course, quietly grumbling behind closed doors about the rules and fines. Some had learned to comply quickly to avoid conflict. Others harbored quiet resentment, believing that the standards were trivial, a waste of time, yet recognizing the inevitability of the penalties. And the HOA, omnipresent in its vigilance, seemed to feed on this tension, its power strengthened by the very fear it inspired. Over the next few days, whispers began to circulate. The homeowner overheard neighbors discussing recent fines and penalties, subtle warnings embedded in casual conversations. A car parked just outside the cul-de-sac bore a notice attached to its windshield, and a few of the residents had red envelopes similar to the one received. Each instance reinforced the omnipotence of the HOA and the idea that any misstep, no matter how minor, could ignite a chain reaction of scrutiny and punishment. The homeowner's unease evolved into a sense of being trapped. The street, once a place of comfort and community, now felt like a meticulously maintained stage, with the HOA as both director and warden. The rules dictated not just appearances but behavior, and the consequences for disobedience were public and humiliating. Yet, beneath the surface of the orderly lawns and painted mailboxes, the seeds of defiance began to stir. there was a growing awareness that the rigid enforcement, while tolerated by many, had its limits, and that even in the quietest streets, tensions could escalate into confrontation. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the freshly trimmed lawns, the homeowner surveyed the neighborhood with a new perspective. Every house, every tree, every fence seemed to radiate the weight of control. Yet, somewhere deep in the quiet corners of the mind, a question lingered. What would happen if someone decided they had enough? If they refused to bow to the perfection demanded by the lawn police? The answer was unknown, and the street held its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between compliance and rebellion. It was only the beginning. The first warning had been issued, the first tension had been felt, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would ripple through the neighborhood. The lawn police had struck again, and the war over lawns, rules, and reputation had begun. The neighborhood that had once felt like a sanctuary of quiet suburban life was beginning to shift in tone. What had started as a minor warning about an overgrown patch of grass had rippled outward, sowing unease among the residents. People walked their streets with measured steps, scanning lawns with a critical eye, wondering who might be next. The HOA's reach, previously invisible and abstract, had become tangible, a presence that hovered over every hedge and mailbox, reminding everyone that perfection was not optional. The homeowner, now hyper-aware of the meticulous scrutiny, noticed small details they had once ignored: a slightly uneven row of bricks in a neighbor's walkway, a faded section of paint on a nearby fence, a mailbox leaning at a fraction of a degree that did not align with the rules. Each imperfection, trivial in any other context, seemed amplified under the unseen gaze of the HOA. Even innocuous actions, like leaving a garden hose coiled on the driveway or allowing a single leaf to fall onto the lawn, felt like potential triggers for another warning. But the tension wasn't limited to silent observation. The first warning had emboldened the lawn police in ways subtle yet unmistakable. Notices began appearing with alarming frequency, each one precise in its language, each one carrying a subtle undertone of intimidation. One neighbor found a letter criticizing the angle of their driveway slope. Another received a fine for planting flowers in the wrong arrangement. The HOA's vigilance had evolved into an omnipresent threat, turning minor infractions into symbols of control, and the street itself into a stage for constant enforcement. The homeowner, though meticulous about compliance, began to sense the growing paranoia among neighbors. There were furtive glances across fences, whispered conversations in driveways, and suspicious pauses when anyone walked past another house. The community, once friendly and relaxed, now operated under an invisible hierarchy of surveillance. Residents spoke of each other less in terms of friendship and more in terms of adherence to rules. Even casual interactions carried the weight of judgment. A shared smile or greeting could be interpreted as a subtle act of defiance or a signal of alignment with the HOA's authority. Amid this climate of unease, rumors began to circulate about a few residents who had attempted small acts of rebellion. One homeowner had left their grass slightly longer than regulations dictated. Another had painted a fence a slightly deeper shade than approved. The consequences were swift and public. Fines arrived like clockwork, attached to mailboxes or slipped under doors, each one a reminder of the stakes. Some residents grumbled privately, some accepted the punishment with reluctant obedience. But the tension grew, feeding the sense that resistance, however minor, would not go unnoticed. The homeowner began noticing patterns in the HOA's enforcement. Certain individuals, often those most vocal or independent, seemed to attract the brunt of scrutiny. Others, more compliant or less conspicuous, remained untouched. It created an unspoken hierarchy within the community, a division between those who quietly endured and those who risked confrontation. This subtle favoritism heightened the tension, fostering suspicion and eroding the camaraderie that had once defined the neighborhood. As days turned into weeks, the homeowner noticed a new element in the enforcement. The lawn police were no longer satisfied with passive observation. Physical markers appeared. Brightly colored flags were placed on lawns to indicate minor infractions, yellow for warnings and red for fines. Photographs of lawns, meticulously taken and labeled with dates, were distributed among residents, creating a network of visual evidence that reinforced the HOA's authority. Every lawn became a display of compliance or defiance, a public record of who had obeyed and who had failed. The psychological impact was significant. Residents began obsessively monitoring their own lawns and those of their neighbors. Conversations revolved around compliance, with complaints about perceived infractions becoming the dominant topic. The once quiet streets buzzed with gossip, each rumor magnified by fear and anticipation. Children played under watchful eyes, and even pets seemed to move cautiously, as though aware of the tension surrounding them. The homeowner, despite their meticulous care, felt the pressure mounting with each passing day. Realizing that the HOA's reach extended far beyond rules, dictated behavior, perception, and social standing. One morning, the homeowner discovered a new notice slipped under the door. This one was different. It referenced not just grass height or fence paint, but the homeowner's choice of potted plants, criticizing their placement in alignment. It was a subtle escalation, a signal that the lawn police were expanding their authority into areas that had previously gone unregulated. The implication was clear. Nothing was safe from scrutiny, and perfection was measured not only by the rules, but by the watchful eyes that interpreted them. Tension escalated further when a few residents reported mysterious surveillance cameras in the neighborhood. Small devices, seemingly innocuous, were spotted on rooftops or tucked among hedges. Though their origin was unclear, the implication was chilling. The HOA's vigilance was not limited to inspections and fines, but extended into real-time monitoring. The homeowner, though careful to follow every rule, felt a growing sense of vulnerability, aware that the mere perception of non-compliance could lead to swift and public consequences. By the end of the week, the street had transformed. What had been a community built on trust and shared space now operated like a tightly controlled zone. Each lawn, mailbox, and driveway, a test of obedience. The homeowner, along with many others, began to experience a mix of anxiety, frustration, and curiosity. Who would be next? Who would break under the pressure? And, perhaps most importantly, who would finally resist the lawn police and risk the inevitable fallout? In this environment, the seeds of confrontation were planted. Compliance had become a burden, observation a constant, and tension an inescapable presence. The homeowner understood that the neighborhood had crossed a threshold. The subtle war between perfection and rebellion was underway, and even minor infractions now carried consequences that rippled through the community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the meticulously maintained lawns, the homeowner surveyed the street with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. Every red flag, every photograph, every whispered conversation reinforced one truth. The lawn police were striking again. And this time the enforcement had become relentless, leaving the residents with a difficult choice: continue under oppressive scrutiny, or risk challenging the authority that had overtaken their once quiet community. The neighborhood, once orderly and placid, now resembled a pressure cooker, its residents trapped between the relentless vigilance of the lawn police and their own growing resentment. What had begun as minor infractions escalated into a culture of fear and suspicion, and under the surface, the first whispers of rebellion began to stir. People who had endured quietly for weeks now wondered if compliance was worth the cost to their pride, independence, and peace of mind. The homeowner, deeply aware of the HOA's intrusive scrutiny, noticed subtle signs that not everyone was willing to accept the growing tyranny. A neighbor who had always been reticent now left their grass intentionally a fraction taller than allowed, testing the boundaries of enforcement. Another resident began planting flowers slightly outside the HOA-approved grid, as though daring anyone to notice. These small acts, almost imperceptible to outsiders, carried enormous symbolic weight. They were the first sparks of defiance, signaling that the lawn police's grip was not absolute. In response, the HOA intensified its monitoring. Red and yellow flags appeared with alarming frequency, each one carefully positioned to make the violation obvious to anyone passing by. Photographs were again taken, labeled, and distributed, But now the residents had begun noticing patterns and inconsistencies. Some lawns received repeated flags for minor deviations, while others remained untouched despite clear infractions. The disparity fostered suspicion about favoritism, bias, or internal politics within the HOA, and it caused neighbors to whisper behind closed doors. The homeowner began to observe these patterns with a mix of fascination and frustration. While compliance had been a way to avoid trouble, now it seemed compliance alone could not guarantee protection. It was clear that the HOA's enforcement was selective, its motivations opaque. The sense of injustice became palpable, feeding both anxiety and the desire to resist. Every notice felt less like a guideline and more like a weapon wielded to establish dominance. This climate of tension gave rise to clandestine communication among neighbors. Quiet conversations at fences, encrypted messages in community apps, and subtle signals in passing interactions allowed residents to exchange warnings about upcoming inspections, advice for resisting fines, or news of recent flag placements. The street, once defined by polite small talk, now buzzed with an undercurrent of plotting, an invisible network of coordination forming beneath the surface of suburban normality. The homeowner became increasingly involved in this underground web of communication. They noted who had received warnings, who had successfully resisted fines, and who had begun documenting every HOA action. The sense of shared purpose began to strengthen the community's resolve. Though fear remained, so did curiosity. And the tension created fertile ground for strategy, observation, and careful planning. Signs of defiance grew bolder. One resident deliberately left their recycling bins slightly misaligned, testing whether the HOA would notice. Another painted their mailbox a darker shade than approved, taking note of whether it would attract scrutiny. Each act, though minor, carried emotional weight. The homeowners were reclaiming a small measure of control, pushing back against the invisible authority that had dominated their lives. The homeowner also began collecting evidence. Photographs, notes, and even video recordings of HOA inspectors in action were stored discreetly, forming a record of selective enforcement and excessive monitoring. This documentation served two purposes. First, it offered protection in case fines or warnings were challenged. Second, it built a foundation for coordinated resistance. Slowly but surely, a blueprint for rebellion was taking shape. At the same time, the psychological effects of the lawn police's surveillance became evident. Residents who had once felt confident in their independence now second-guessed every action. Mowing, planting, pruning, or even the placement of outdoor furniture became a source of anxiety. People began obsessing over angles, distances, and measurements, conducting multiple inspections of their own properties before stepping away. The lawn, once a simple patch of grass, had become a stage on which authority, fear, and pride collided. Meanwhile, subtle acts of solidarity began to emerge. One morning, the homeowner noticed neighbors leaving supportive notes on each other's doors, encouraging vigilance or commending minor victories against enforcement. Others began sharing tips for bending the rules without triggering fines, such as staggering watering schedules or using color matching to mask slightly misaligned flower beds. These small, quiet actions strengthened bonds and hinted at the potential for a broader, coordinated response. As the days passed, the homeowner realized that the tension was no longer just about lawns. It had evolved into a social war, a struggle for autonomy, respect, and dignity. The lawn police had unintentionally fostered a climate of resistance. Every red flag, every photograph, and every notice had provoked thought, discussion, and strategy. Residents had begun to see themselves not merely as subjects of enforcement, but as participants in a game that demanded intelligence, subtlety, and courage. The first significant act of rebellion arrived unexpectedly. A resident, known for their quiet demeanor, left their front lawn intentionally untended for a full week, fully aware that the HOA would issue a warning. When the notice arrived, it was ignored. The act was small, almost symbolic, yet it rippled through the neighborhood. It inspired others to test boundaries, document discrepancies, and challenge the selective application of rules. Fear still lingered, but so did determination. For the homeowner, these developments were both exciting and alarming. The neighborhood had reached a tipping point. Compliance alone would no longer suffice, and the HOA's methods, though precise and intimidating, were beginning to encounter the first cracks of resistance. Every red flag, every photograph, every whispered conversation had contributed to a growing awareness. Talon Police's authority was not invincible. As the sun set over the meticulously trimmed lawns, the homeowner observed the street with a mixture of caution and anticipation. The quiet rebellion was growing, subtle but undeniable. Conversations had shifted from anxiety to strategy, from fear to empowerment. This stage was set for the next phase of the conflict. A more organized, deliberate challenge to the HOA's dominance. The seeds of resistance had been planted, and for the first time in weeks, the homeowner allowed themselves to imagine the possibility of reclaiming not only their lawn, but the autonomy and dignity of the entire neighborhood. The neighborhood, once a symbol of quiet suburban life, had transformed into a theater of subtle defiance and growing tension. The acts of rebellion that had begun quietly in Chapter 3 now began to draw attention. The HOA, previously content with issuing warnings and fines, appeared to sense the first real resistance. Its presence was no longer passive. The lawn police had stepped up their game, determined to remind the residents that authority would not be challenged lightly. The homeowner, along with a small circle of neighbors who had begun exchanging tips and observations, noticed an escalation in the HOA's enforcement tactics. Inspectors began visiting more frequently, walking slowly along sidewalks and driveways as though scrutinizing every blade of grass, every garden edging, every decorative stone. Their measured steps, the deliberate pauses, and the seemingly endless note-taking created an aura of omnipresence, reinforcing the idea that nothing could escape observation. The first direct confrontation came unexpectedly. A neighbor who had quietly defied a minor rule, leaving a small section of lawn intentionally approached in their driveway by an HOA inspector. The interaction was strictly procedural, but its implications were clear. The HOA would not tolerate defiance. The homeowner, witnessing this from a nearby window, felt a mix of anxiety and determination. This moment crystallized the stakes. Resistance was no longer theoretical. It carried immediate, tangible consequences. In the following days, subtle signs of conflict emerged across the street. Residents who had previously ignored minor infractions now received in-person visits, while letters and flags continued to proliferate. Each interaction seemed designed to test compliance and intimidation, to provoke reaction, and to assert dominance. The homeowner carefully documented every visit, every notice, and every conversation, creating a growing archive of the HOA's methods. Patterns became apparent. The HOA targeted individuals selectively, prioritized visible acts of defiance, and sought to maintain psychological pressure over physical presence. The tension reached a new level when the homeowner observed the HOA strategically placing warning flags in unexpected locations. A neighbor who had followed every rule to the letter discovered a small red flag tucked behind a garden ornament, a violation, technically undetectable without the HOA's guidance. The subtle escalation sent a clear message. Even compliance offered no immunity. The lawn police were not merely enforcing rules. They were reinforcing power, shaping behavior, and asserting their ability to manipulate perception. The homeowner, sensing an opportunity, began planning the first organized challenge. It was clear that passive endurance would no longer suffice. The small circle of neighbors exchanged observations, debated strategies, and coordinated timing for small, controlled acts of defiance. The homeowner suggested documenting each encounter meticulously, creating undeniable evidence of selective enforcement. These preparations were cautious, calculated, and deliberate, step measured against the risk of retaliation. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of the escalating confrontations was evident. Residents experienced heightened anxiety, disrupted routines, and a pervasive sense of being constantly watched. Mowing schedules were adjusted, garden ornaments repositioned, and fences examined daily for alignment. Even social interactions were influenced by the fear of being judged or reported. The homeowner recognized that the HOA had succeeded in one respect. They had transformed the neighborhood into a microcosm of constant vigilance, where each act of daily life was potentially scrutinized. Yet this same pressure sparked creativity and resilience. Small acts of rebellion multiplied, each designed to test the boundaries of the HOA's authority. A neighbor planted flowers in unconventional patterns. Another installed a garden gnome at an unapproved angle. Yet another allowed a tree branch to slightly overhang the sidewalk. Each minor deviation was carefully documented, photographed, and shared within the network of residents quietly resisting the lawn police. The homeowner began to see a pattern emerging. The more oppressive the enforcement, the more inventive the defiance. The first coordinated act of resistance occurred when a group of neighbors simultaneously left subtle, rule-defying adjustments in their yards. Grassed patches slightly longer than allowed, decorations placed just beyond approved boundaries, and minor structural deviations all timed to coincide with an anticipated HOA inspection. The homeowner watched from their window as the inspectors arrived, cameras and notebooks in hand, and noticed the fleeting confusion in their demeanor. The synchronized defiance, though small in scope, challenged the illusion of absolute authority. The HOA's reaction was swift but measured. Inspectors documented every deviation, issued additional notices, and increased their frequency of visits. Yet the homeowner observed cracks in their effectiveness. The psychological impact of coordinated defiance became evident. Inspectors hesitated, measured their approach more carefully, and sometimes overlooked minor violations altogether. The balance of power, while still weighted toward the HOA, had shifted perceptibly. The neighborhood had discovered that unity, even in small, subtle acts, could challenge authority. The homeowner also noted an important side effect. Community bonds strengthened, conversations shifted from whispered grievances to strategic planning. Shared frustration transformed into shared purpose, and neighbors began to recognize the potential power of collective action. The street, once fragmented by fear and suspicion, started exhibiting signs of cohesion, with residents quietly acknowledging one another's acts of courage and resilience. By the end of the week, the tension had reached a new equilibrium. The HOA maintained its enforcement, but residents had begun to reclaim a measure of autonomy, confidence, and strategy. The first confrontation had proven that the lawn police, while intimidating, were not invincible. Resistance, when coordinated and measured, could create leverage, disrupt assumptions, and inspire confidence. The homeowner, surveying the street at dusk, felt a cautious optimism. The lawn police were watching. Rules remained strict, and authority loomed. But the neighborhood had discovered a critical truth. Control was not absolute, and defiance, even subtle, could be effective. The next phase of the struggle would require courage, planning, and coordination, but the first confrontation had illuminated a path forward. The seeds of organized rebellion had been planted. The initial spark of resistance ignited, and the homeowner realized that the battle for autonomy, dignity, and freedom within the neighborhood had truly begun. The neighborhood, once subdued under the weight of constant surveillance, had transformed into a battleground of strategy, subtle rebellion, and unspoken alliances. The first coordinated defiance had emboldened residents, and now the homeowner could sense a growing momentum. Fear had not disappeared, but it was tempered by a newfound resolve. The lawn police, while still formidable, were beginning to encounter challenges they had not anticipated. The homeowner observed that the previously isolated acts of defiance were now connecting, forming patterns of resistance that were difficult to ignore. Grass blades deliberately left a fraction too long, garden ornaments slightly misaligned, and fences that subtly exceeded HOA-approved boundaries. Each minor infraction, when multiplied across the street, created a web of contradictions that strained the HOA's enforcement capacity. The inspectors, once confident and methodical, were now facing subtle chaos, a neighborhood increasingly unpredictable and resistant. Communication among residents intensified. Digital group chats, private messaging, and whispered exchanges over fences became critical tools for coordination. The homeowner noticed neighbors sharing photographs of flags, notices, and inspections, cataloging each event for both strategy and documentation. These records were not just evidence, they were instruments of empowerment, revealing patterns of selective enforcement and demonstrating the limits of the HOA's influence. One morning, a particularly bold act of rebellion shook the neighborhood. A resident, well known for their meticulous adherence to rules, deliberately ignored a minor grass height requirement. The HOA responded predictably, placing a red flag in the yard, but this time the homeowner and others had prepared. Photographs were taken, Notes were documented, and the act of defiance was celebrated quietly as a symbol of courage. Word spread quickly. Enforcement could be challenged, and the lawn police were not omnipotent. The homeowner also began experimenting with psychological tactics. Subtle signs of unity appeared across lawns. Matching garden decorations, color-coded flags, and symbolic arrangements that conveyed quiet solidarity. The HOA inspectors noticed, but could not easily interpret the meaning. Residents, previously isolated, now shared an implicit understanding. Each small gesture reinforced collective identity and the idea that the neighborhood was no longer fragmented by fear. Tensions escalated further when the HOA attempted a larger, more public inspection. Several inspectors visited multiple homes in a single day, photographing lawns, measuring hedges, and taking meticulous notes. The homeowner, however, had anticipated this move. Residents coordinated so that minor infractions appeared in patterns across several properties. The HOA, confronted with simultaneous violations in multiple locations, struggled to enforce compliance without appearing arbitrary or inconsistent. The balance of power, previously weighted heavily toward authority, began to shift. The homeowner also documented the subtle psychological impact on the lawn police. Inspectors hesitated before issuing fines, double-checked measurements, and appeared increasingly aware of the neighborhood's coordinated behavior. The streets, once silent under intimidation, now hummed with quiet defiance. Grass blades, flower beds, and decorative arrangements had become instruments of rebellion, symbols of agency, and reminders that authority could be contested. By midweek, the homeowner noticed another significant development. Acts of defiance had become more audacious. Residents experimented with bending multiple rules, at once planting slightly taller flowers, allowing grass to grow unevenly, and arranging decorations that technically violated HOA standards. Each act was deliberate, calculated, and documented. The neighborhood was no longer merely resisting individually. It had become a coordinated force. The HOA, sensing the growing challenge, escalated their tactics. Notices arrived in thicker stacks, inspections occurred more frequently, and inspectors were visibly frustrated. Yet each escalation further galvanized the residents. Acts of defiance multiplied, and collective morale improved. The more the lawn police pressed, the more inventive the resistance became. The homeowner observed that the neighborhood had discovered a critical insight. The more oppressive the rules, the more creativity and cohesion they inspired. The homeowner also began tracking communication and documentation efforts more systematically. Photographs, videos, and digital logs of HOA interactions were meticulously cataloged, creating an irrefutable archive. Each image, flag, and notice contributed to a growing understanding of enforcement patterns and weaknesses. This archive not only documented injustices, but also offered strategic insight into how to challenge the lawn police effectively. Subtle leadership emerged among the residents. The homeowner became a focal point for coordination, guiding discussions, sharing strategies, and analyzing the effectiveness of various acts of defiance. Others contributed expertise in photography, measurement, and social organization. The street had become a microcosm of collective action, where every participant had a role, and every act, however minor, carried significance. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had reached a tipping point. The lawn police, previously confident in their authority, were visibly strained. Residents were united, coordinated, and emboldened. Compliance was no longer the default, and fear had been replaced by cautious confidence. The homeowner realized that the stage was set for a decisive confrontation, one that could determine the ultimate balance of power between the HOA and the neighborhood. As the sun set over the coordinated lawns, the homeowner felt a mixture of anticipation and resolve. The acts of rebellion, the growing sense of solidarity, and the systematic documentation of HOA enforcement had created a new reality. The neighborhood had discovered that authority could be challenged, that defiance could be effective, and that unity was a powerful tool. The stage was now set for the climax. The lawn police had forced the first cracks in their own authority, and the neighborhood, guided by the homeowner's careful observation and strategic planning, was ready to escalate the resistance further. The next confrontation would not be subtle. It would be decisive, public, and impossible for the HOA to ignore. The tension that had been building for weeks reached its peak on a crisp, early morning when the HOA announced a large-scale inspection of the entire street. Notices had been distributed, warnings posted, and inspectors scheduled in unprecedented numbers. The homeowner and the coordinated residents had anticipated this moment, the ultimate test of their resilience, creativity, and unity. From sunrise, the streets were alive with quiet preparation. Grass blades were left just slightly longer than allowed. Decorative arrangements were subtly misaligned, and flower beds were artfully cluttered with small, symbolic markers of rebellion. These acts, though minor, individually, collectively, formed a landscape of defiance that was impossible to ignore. Every homeowner understood their role. Each detail was intentional, strategic, and designed to challenge the authority of the lawn police. When the inspectors arrived, they were confronted with a neighborhood transformed. Every house presented small but noticeable infractions. Red flags, warnings, and notices were already accumulating, but the inspectors quickly realized that enforcement was no longer straightforward. The scale of violations was too large, the patterns too coordinated. Attempting to fine each resident individually would expose the HOA to claims of selective enforcement, bias, and overreach. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. The homeowner watched with satisfaction as the inspectors moved from house to house, double-checking measurements and taking copious notes. Their confidence, once unquestionable, faltered under the weight of coordinated resistance. Every act of defiance, every subtle gesture of unity, reinforced the growing sense that authority could be contested, challenged, and even overcome. The streets, once silent and obedient, now hummed with a collective energy that was both tangible and empowering. At strategic moments, the homeowner captured photographs, videos, and documentation of each inspection. These records were not just evidence, they were a statement of resilience. The images revealed the absurdity of attempting to control a unified neighborhood and highlighted the meticulous coordination that had been quietly orchestrated. By mid-morning, it was clear that the lawn police were facing their first real test of authority, one they were ill-prepared to meet. As the day progressed, residents grew bolder. Minor infractions escalated in creative ways. Garden ornaments were arranged in clusters that technically violated spacing rules. Fences were subtly adjusted to exceed HOA-approved dimensions, and lawn patterns were intentionally uneven. Each action was carefully calculated to maximize visibility while minimizing legal vulnerability. The inspectors, once methodical and confident, were now visibly frustrated, uncertain, and increasingly hesitant. The homeowner observed the psychological shift with satisfaction. Inspectors began hesitating before issuing citations, questioning measurements, and debating the legitimacy of minor infractions. Residents, once fearful, were emboldened by this hesitation. Collective confidence replaced fear, and a sense of empowerment spread across the street. The homeowner understood that the battle was no longer just about individual lawns. It was about reclaiming control and asserting the community's collective will. By mid-afternoon, a turning point emerged. One of the inspectors, visibly flustered, attempted to confront a particularly bold display of defiance at the end of the block. The homeowner, already prepared, documented the exchange meticulously. Residents nearby recorded the interaction, creating a body of evidence that showcased both the absurdity of strict enforcement and the effectiveness of coordinated resistance. Word spread quickly. The HOA could no longer act without scrutiny. The climax of the day came when the homeowner orchestrated a final act of unified defiance. Residents lined their driveways with matching symbols of solidarity. Small flags, coordinated flower arrangements, and visible signs that celebrated neighborhood unity. The visual impact was striking. Inspectors paused, photographed, and documented. But even they could not ignore the message. The neighborhood was united, informed, and resilient. Authority, once absolute, had been challenged openly and decisively. By evening, the inspectors concluded their rounds. Visibly overwhelmed and unable to enforce penalties without appearing arbitrary or biased. The neighborhood, led by the homeowner's strategic planning, had successfully shifted the balance of power. The lawn police, once feared and unquestioned, were now constrained, hesitant, and aware that their authority was no longer absolute. The following days brought formal changes. The HOA, recognizing the limits of enforcement and the growing collective strength of the residents, revised rules, moderated inspections, and re-evaluated punitive measures. Homeowner, documentation, and the neighborhood. Coordinated resistance played a crucial role in ensuring that future enforcement would be more reasonable, transparent, and equitable. The street itself changed not just in appearance, but in spirit. Lawn care became a symbol of individual expression rather than a source of fear. Residents interacted openly, supported one another, and celebrated the triumph of collective action over intimidation. The atmosphere, once tense and fraught with anxiety, became vibrant, confident, and resilient. For the homeowner, the victory was deeply personal. Months of observation, planning, and quiet leadership had culminated in a decisive moment where strategy, unity, and courage overcame fear and authoritarian control. The neighborhood had reclaimed its autonomy, and the HOA was reminded that power could be contested when residents acted collectively and strategically. In the end, the lawn police's reign of intimidation was broken. Grass, blooders, fences, and flower beds were no longer tools of fear, but symbols of resilience, creativity, and community strength. The homeowner understood that this was more than a victory over arbitrary enforcement. It was a reaffirmation of the neighborhood's right to self-determination. As the sun set over the now harmonious street, the homeowner surveyed the lawns, each one a testament to collective courage and quiet defiance. The neighborhood had been transformed, not through confrontation or chaos, but through unity, strategic planning, and the power of shared purpose. The lawn police would remember this day, and so would the residents. Authority could be challenged, rules could be questioned, and a community united in defiance could achieve lasting change. The chapter closed on a neighborhood that had learned the strength of solidarity, the importance of vigilance, and the power of strategic action. The lawn police strike again had not been a story of fear and suppression. It had become a story of resilience, triumph, and the enduring power of a community that refused to be controlled.